It was May 1945. The war in Europe had ended. At least, that's what the newspapers said. But along the borderlands of northern Germany, peace was still a fragile, trembling thing. The air smelled of smoke and hunger. Roads were choked with the sound of wheels and footsteps, an endless column of people walking nowhere, carrying everything they owned in small bundles of cloth. These were not soldiers. They were the forgotten ones of war, German refugees, fleeing from the Soviet advance, terrified of what might come next. Mothers pushed carts with infants wrapped in blankets. Elderly men leaned on sticks, eyes hollow from exhaustion. Children cried not from pain, but from a fear too big for their small bodies to understand. And on the other side of the border stood the unexpected, the British troops, uniformed, weary, and watchful. They had fought through Normandy, through Holland, and into Germany itself. They had seen death in all its forms. And now, in this strange calm after victory, they faced a new kind of challenge. One that didn't come with orders or strategy, or even glory. No one had told them what to do with thousands of refugees wandering toward them, desperate to cross the border into safety. No manual explained how to deal with enemy civilians who were no longer enemies, yet still bore the face of the nation that had bombed their cities and killed their friends. But when a group of refugees reached the checkpoint, tattered, starving, shivering, the British commander made a quiet decision that day. Instead of turning them away, he ordered his men to lower their rifles and open the gates. For a moment, history hesitated. The victors became protectors. The enemies became the saved. And for the first time in years, humanity triumphed over war. This is the forgotten story of how British soldiers helped German refugees cross safely into Denmark, defying hatred, orders, and sometimes even their own hearts. A moment when compassion broke through the smoke of World War II and reminded the world what peace could look like. To understand that single act of mercy, we must return to the final chaotic weeks of World War II in Europe. The Third Reich was collapsing. Cities lay in ruins. The roads were broken veins spilling people instead of armies, and every direction seemed to lead to danger. From the east, the Red Army surged forward, vengeful after years of devastation. From the west, British and American forces advanced, liberating towns and dismantling what was left of German command. Between those fronts stretched millions of terrified civilians who no longer knew where home was. Among them were German refugees from East Prussia, Pomerania, and the Baltic coast. Entire villages packed onto horse carts or simply walked, hoping to reach the relative safety of the British occupation zone or to cross into Denmark. Word had spread that the British treated civilians more humanely than the Soviets. That rumor became a fragile hope, passed from mouth to mouth like a prayer. But the journey was merciless. Spring came late that year, and cold rain turned dirt roads into rivers of mud. Columns of refugees moved day and night, afraid to stop. Air raid sirens had fallen silent, but hunger replaced the terror of bombs. Fields were stripped bare. Bridges had been blown apart by retreating German engineers. Every mile forward meant another body left behind. For the British soldiers stationed along the northern border, the war was supposed to be over. The 8th Corps, part of the British Second Army, had moved into Schleswig-Holstein to oversee the German surrender. The men expected rest, perhaps even celebration. Instead, they found themselves confronting an ocean of displaced people. Soldiers without uniforms, civilians without homes, children without nations. The official policy was uncertain. Britain's War Office had not issued clear instructions for dealing with refugees of the former enemy. The Allies feared infiltration, chaos, disease. Some officers argued that borders should remain sealed until proper camps were established. Yet others, seeing the human misery before them, couldn't bring themselves to enforce such cold logic. At one small checkpoint near the Elbe River, the decision came down to a handful of men. Their commanding officer, Major John Templeton, had spent years fighting across Europe. He had seen towns burned, comrades buried, and civilians caught in the crossfire of ideology. Templeton believed the war had revealed enough cruelty. He would not let it continue under his watch. When the first refugee group appeared, mostly women and children, His men hesitated. The soldiers recognized the fear in those faces. Some still wore the same insignia as enemy soldiers they had fought only months earlier. Yet none carried weapons. One of the privates later wrote in his diary, "They didn't look like Germans anymore. They looked like people who had run out of world to hide in." Word spread quickly. Columns of refugees followed, stretching for miles, pleading for entry. The small British unit soon faced an impossible moral burden. Every decision meant life or death for hundreds. To open the border might mean disobeying standing orders. To close it meant condemning innocents to starvation or capture. Meanwhile, across the frontier in Denmark, the situation was equally dire. Danish towns had been under German occupation for 5 years. Now, with liberation near, resentment simmered. Danish civilians feared that accepting German refugees would be seen as betrayal. Their hospitals were already overrun. Food was rationed to the bone. Yet a humanitarian instinct also stirred. Priests, nurses, and local farmers secretly began preparing barns and churches to shelter whoever came. The British command in Hamburg began receiving urgent reports. Tens of thousands of displaced Germans massing near the border. The army could no longer pretend it was a temporary issue. Diplomats worried about disease outbreaks, unrest, and the political optics of aiding former enemies. Yet on the ground, none of that mattered. The soldiers saw not politics, but faces. Thin, pale, exhausted faces that looked too human to ignore. Major Templeton made his choice quietly. Without broadcasting it up the chain of command, he authorized small groups to cross under British escort. His men guided them to safe zones, coordinated with Danish relief workers, and even provided military rations. It was, in many ways, the first act of reconciliation in a Europe still smoldering from war. But mercy rarely comes without consequence. As word of Templeton's action spread, questions rose within British headquarters. Were these men heroes of humanity, or soldiers defying orders? The lines between compassion and insubordination blurred dangerously. The following days would test every boundary between victory and vengeance, duty and conscience. By the second week of May 1945, the refugee situation had reached a breaking point. Tens of thousands of German civilians, many from East Prussia and Pomerania, crowded near the Elbe and Flensburg borders, desperate to escape the advance of Soviet troops. For them, surrendering to the British Army meant a chance at life. Being caught by the Soviets meant vengeance, imprisonment, or worse. From the British side, the war had technically ended. Soldiers who had once stormed the beaches of Normandy now manned quiet checkpoints in the damp northern countryside. They longed to go home. Instead, they found themselves facing endless lines of starving, ragged civilians begging for passage into Denmark, a country barely recovering from its own occupation. Major John Templeton and his company of infantrymen had turned their small outpost into a lifeline. They escorted the sick, fed the weak, and even arranged wagons to carry the elderly. Every day they allowed more groups through, quietly, without official authorization. The men of the unit understood that the decision could cost them their careers, but they no longer cared. They had seen too much to stand by. Templeton's field journal, later recovered from military archives, described the moment plainly. "If this is disobedience, then I'll answer for it. But I'll not shut the gates on children." Word of this British mercy crossing spread like wildfire among the refugees. Each night, new groups arrived, sometimes entire families, sometimes just lone survivors. Some carried small signs made from scraps of paper. "Please help us. We are not soldiers." Others approached silently, eyes hollow from hunger, afraid that a wrong word could send them back into chaos. The border soon became a landscape of desperation. Rain turned the dirt into thick sludge, soaking the refugees' clothing. British soldiers tore canvas from their supply trucks to create makeshift shelters. They rationed their own food, splitting cans of corned beef and biscuits with the families they guarded. The war had taught them to destroy, but now they were learning painfully how to save. Not everyone approved. Some officers in nearby divisions questioned why Templeton's men were expending resources on enemy civilians. One commander, passing through the checkpoint, scolded him harshly. "You're not running a charity, Major. These people are the same ones who cheered when London burned." Templeton didn't respond. He simply nodded and continued loading food crates into the refugee wagons. For his men, the moral clarity was undeniable. These weren't the architects of the Reich. They were its collateral damage. They had lived under propaganda, fear, and dictatorship. Now they were running from it. In the nearby Danish town of Padborg, local villagers began to hear about the British crossings. At first they were wary. Memories of occupation were still raw. But when they saw the condition of the refugees arriving across the border, many put aside resentment. They opened barns, cleared old schools, and turned churches into temporary shelters. A handful of Danish nurses volunteered to treat frostbite and dysentery cases, working alongside British medics. The cooperation between the British soldiers and Danish civilians was unofficial, even illegal in some eyes, but it grew quickly. Soon, columns of refugees were moving safely under British escort through checkpoints into Denmark, where makeshift camps awaited them. Meanwhile, reports began reaching British headquarters in Hamburg. Intelligence officers were alarmed. They feared that uncontrolled crossings could spiral into chaos. If tens of thousands poured across without coordination, it could destabilize an already fragile post-war region. Telegrams were sent. Investigations were ordered. Templeton and his men were told to halt all crossings until new directives were issued. But the refugees kept coming. One night, a young British corporal named Peter Lawson stood guard as a group approached through the mist, mostly women clutching infants, one pushing a wheelbarrow carrying her elderly father. Lawson hesitated, recalling the new order. Then the old man raised a trembling hand and said in broken English, "Please, only peace." Lawson lifted the barrier. Within hours, another 100 crossed. The soldiers knew they were disobeying, but they also knew the alternative: to watch families die at their gates. Back in Hamburg, a stern memorandum arrived from Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's staff. Unauthorized refugee transfers were to cease immediately. The message warned that any officer caught facilitating German movements without clearance would face disciplinary review. But by then it was too late. The crossings had become unstoppable. Even local German townspeople began joining the operation, helping refugees reach the British lines. Some wore armbands that read, "Not enemy, civilian." A strange alliance formed among people who, only weeks before, had been mortal enemies. The tension reached its peak when a convoy of British military police arrived to inspect Templeton's post. They expected to find contraband or smuggling operations. Instead, they found soldiers cooking soup over field stoves and children asleep under army blankets. The senior officer in charge, stunned by the sight, simply stared. After a long pause, he muttered, "Bloody hell, Templeton! What have you done here?" Templeton replied quietly, "We've stopped fighting." The officer didn't report him. Instead, he stayed for the night, helping distribute food. The next morning, he left without a word, and the refugees continued to cross. By the end of May, it was estimated that over 200,000 German refugees had reached safety in Denmark under British oversight. Many were later transferred to organized camps, where they would remain for years. Some never returned home. Others wrote letters to the British soldiers who had helped them, calling them the first light after the darkness. But the moral cost weighed heavily on the men. Templeton's unit was quietly reassigned, and no public recognition was given. Their actions were buried in the quiet pages of after-war reports, overshadowed by larger headlines of victory, trials, and reconstruction. Yet in that borderland, amid the wreckage of war, something rare had occurred. Soldiers who had learned only to kill discovered that compassion, too, could be an act of courage. The rain had not stopped for days. The sky hung low and gray over the borderlands, as though the clouds themselves refused to move on from the war. Refugee columns still approached in silence, lines of figures trudging through the mud, their steps slow, their faces expressionless. They had learned not to hope too loudly. Hope could still die. At the British checkpoint near Flensburg, the men of Major John Templeton's unit worked with numb precision. They had long stopped counting how many crossed each day. Hundreds, sometimes thousands. Each group looked the same, thin, exhausted, and afraid to speak. The soldiers' uniforms were dirty from days of lifting, loading, and carrying, but no one complained anymore. Then came the morning that changed everything. At dawn, Templeton received a direct order from the regional British command. Cease all crossings immediately. The message bore the official seal of the British Army of the Rhine. Violations, it warned, would be treated as dereliction of duty. No exceptions. Templeton read it twice, then folded the paper slowly. Around him, his men watched in silence. They already knew what it meant. The order had come from London itself. The Mersey crossings were no longer a secret. They had reached political ears. But as the soldiers prepared to obey, a scout came running. "Sir, there's another group coming," he said. "A big one. Maybe 1,000 or more. Mostly women and children. Some wounded." Templeton stared toward the horizon. Through the drizzle he saw them, figures stretching far into the fields, their clothes clinging to their skin, a few limping beside horse-drawn carts. The column moved slowly, burdened by hunger and fear. He looked at the order again, then at his men, then at the refugees. Every instinct as a soldier told him to follow command. Every instinct as a human told him not to. For several long seconds no one moved. Then Templeton spoke quietly. "Open the gates." No one argued. The soldiers moved quickly, forming a line to guide the refugees across. The sound of boots and wooden wheels mixed with the rain. Mothers wept openly as they stepped onto Danish soil, whispering thanks through chapped lips. One woman fell to her knees and kissed the mud. Templeton watched, his jaw tight, knowing what it meant for him. He would likely face inquiry, perhaps even court-martial. But in that moment, it didn't matter. Orders had ended a war. Kindness would end the hatred. That afternoon, as the last of the refugees crossed, several jeeps approached flying British flags. Out stepped a delegation from headquarters, officers, clerks, and a colonel whose uniform was spotless despite the mud. The colonel's expression was cold. "Major Templeton," he said, "you were given a direct order this morning." "Yes, sir." "And yet you continued crossings." Templeton's voice was steady. "Yes, sir." The colonel's eyes hardened. "You realize this is disobedience under military law?" Templeton didn't hesitate. "I do, but respectfully, sir. There are laws older than ours." The colonel glanced past him at the refugees gathered beyond the checkpoint. Children huddled under British blankets, soldiers sharing rations, a wounded boy being treated by a medic using a torn bandage from his own sleeve. For a moment the officer's face softened. He said nothing. Then, with a sigh, he turned to his men. "Seal the post once they're across," he ordered. "Then file your report." Templeton saluted silently. That night the checkpoint was quiet for the first time in weeks. The soldiers sat by the fire, their faces lit by a faint glow. They didn't talk about orders or consequences, only about the people they had helped. Some wondered what would happen to them next. Others said nothing at all. 2 days later, the colonel's report reached headquarters. It noted that Major Templeton's unit had acted with initiative under extraordinary humanitarian circumstances. There was no mention of disobedience, no reprimand, no praise. The British Army chose silence, a silence that, in its own way, protected everyone involved. Across the border in Denmark, refugee camps began to fill. The Danish Red Cross coordinated with British medics to provide food, shelter, and medical aid. Though conditions were harsh, the refugees were alive. For many, it was the first time in years they could sleep without fear of gunfire. Templeton and his men were later reassigned to post-war duties. They left the border quietly, without ceremony. The fields they had guarded became peaceful again, marked only by faint ruts in the mud where thousands had walked to freedom. Years later, historians would uncover fragments of the story, field logs, letters, and witness accounts from German families who spoke of the British soldiers who opened the gates. They described faces they never forgot, men who treated them not as enemies, but as humans. It was a small story, overshadowed by the grand scale of war, but for those who lived it, it was the moment the world began to heal. When the guns of World War II finally went silent, Europe was a continent of ghosts. Cities smoldered, families were scattered, and nations struggled to remember what mercy felt like. Amid this vast ruin, small acts of compassion, often unseen and unrecorded, became the first steps toward rebuilding humanity. The story of the British troops who helped German refugees across the border was one of those rare, forgotten acts that whispered louder than any victory parade. For the soldiers who stood at that muddy checkpoint, the war never truly ended with surrender. It ended when they lowered their rifles and opened their hands. Men who had once been trained to destroy realized that peace wasn't just the absence of battle. It was the deliberate choice to do good when the world least expected it. In the months that followed, thousands of German civilians continued to live in Danish camps under British supervision. The conditions were hard. Disease spread easily, and rations were scarce, but they were alive. Slowly, Danish nurses, British officers, and German mothers learned to coexist. They shared bread, water, and eventually, fragile words of gratitude. For the first time in years, people from three nations, once at war, began to build trust. Major John Templeton never received a medal. His name did not appear in the official histories of the British Army. But among the refugees who crossed the border, his memory endured. Letters were written, some addressed to the British officer who showed us mercy. Decades later, those letters surfaced in archives, their words faded but powerful. "You gave us our lives back," one woman wrote. "I still see the face of the soldier who smiled when I carried my baby across." Historians now recognize the Flensburg crossings as an early example of post-war humanitarian action, an unplanned, unofficial operation that saved tens of thousands. It challenged the notion that compassion could wait for orders. It proved that even in the wreckage of empire and ideology, human decency could still find its way. For the British soldiers, that lesson outlasted the war. Many returned home carrying images not of victory, but of refugees walking into safety. One private later told his son, "The only thing I'm proud of is that, for once, I didn't have to fire my gun." And for the refugees, the memory of that day became a story passed down through generations, a reminder that mercy had worn a British uniform. In a time when Europe's borders were lines of division, one small checkpoint had become a bridge. There were no cameras, no applause, no medals pinned to uniforms, only the quiet footsteps of those who crossed, and the silent resolve of those who let them through. The Second World War had revealed humanity's darkest depths. But here, on a cold northern border, it also revealed its faintest light. When historians write about the war, they often measure it in battles won and empires lost. But sometimes history lives in smaller moments. When an officer refuses to close a gate, when soldiers share rations with strangers, when compassion replaces command. That is the real end of war. And in the silence that followed, the border remembered everything.